Hello, welcome to Nature Knowledge. This is a speaker series sharing scientific knowledge on current issues affecting nature in Florida. I'm Dr. Shelly Johnson, State Specialized Extension Agent in Natural Resources with UF IFAS Natural Resources Extension at the University of Florida, and I'm the host of this program. Glad to see everyone here today.
Just to provide some context, this is going to be an introductory level presentation. I want to make sure that no matter where you are, you've got everyone's on the same sort of line. So I'm going to start off giving an overview of harmful algal blooms in Florida. Cyanobacteria are a type of harmful algal bloom, but they're one of many that we have in Florida. And this picture that I've showed you is just sort of a very simple graphical format of the variety of blooms that we have here in the state. And all this is meant to show you is that Florida, as a state in the United States, has the dubious recognition of having the most diverse harmful algal blooms in the country. And you can see that there are a variety of different types. They're impacting a variety of different water bodies, large, small, freshwater, saltwater, as well as being geographically different. So this is really important when we're talking about living with harmful algal blooms, managing harmful algal blooms, is that it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. You really have to understand the local water body, you have to understand the hydrology, the weather patterns in that system, but also the unique differences of those bloom species. So the outline I'm going to be talking about today, first I'm going to discuss what are cyanobacteria, just so we can all, again, be on the same sort of baseline. I'm going to provide us an overview of cyanobacterial blooms in Florida, and then focus on a case study of the cyanobacteria blooms in Lake Okeechobee, specifically the 2018 algae blooms. So what are cyanobacteria? Most of the time when we hear about cyanobacteria blooms, they're often referred to as blue-green algae. And we think about them in the concept of being a harmful algal bloom. If you look at the top left picture in this series, this is a cyanobacterial bloom in the St. Johns River. And it has that real distinct sort of bluish green coloration to it. However, despite that name, blue-green algae, cyanobacteria are actually photosynthetic bacteria. They are not algae, meaning they are not plants. But because they photosynthesize, they have the same pigments as some plants, mainly chlorophyll A, and they also have a unique pigment, phycocyanin, that's unique to cyanobacteria. And this phycocyanin is what gives cyanobacteria their name. So phyco meaning relating to seaweed, cyanin meaning relating to the color blue. But it's important to note that cyanobacteria are extremely diverse, both morphologically as well as ecologically. And so they can exist in these freshwater systems that we're most used to, but they can also exist in saltwater systems, in extreme systems. And while they prefer warm temperatures, you can even find them in freezing temperatures. So if we're going to go sort of clockwise around this pictorial, the top right picture is a picture of a cyanobacteria bloom in the Red Sea. This is a saltwater cyanobacteria, Trichodesmium, and one of the theories is that the Red Sea got its name because of these seasonal blooms of red colored cyanobacteria. Moving down to the bottom right corner, you can see the hot springs at Yellowstone National Park, and those vivid colors in the thermal vents are from, again, cyanobacteria living in extreme environments. And as mentioned previously, in the lower left-hand corner, this is ice algae or snow algae that's found in extreme cold weather. So while we often think of cyanobacteria blooms in warm temperatures, although that's their preferred, that's not the only place that we're going to find them. Whoops. Okay. So again, just to refresh your memory, they are photosynthetic bacteria. This is a really simple phylogenetic tree just to show how different cyanobacteria are from algae, which are plants. That being said, they're extraordinarily important, diverse, and prolific. So in fact, cyanobacteria are ancient, and they have the distinction of being the oldest known fossils to date, fossil dating back to approximately 3 billion years old, which is pretty cool. And they're also ecologically essential. So cyanobacteria are responsible for providing oxygen in the atmosphere that we have today, and they still remain to be large contributors of the oxygen, of today's oxygen budget in the atmosphere. They are responsible for plants functioning the way that they know it. We know all plants photosynthesize, and about 1 to 2 billion years ago, plants actually became able to photosynthesize through an endosymbiotic relationship with cyanobacteria. What's thought to happen is that either through parasitism or through feeding, an early eukaryotic cell actually engulfed a cyanobacteria, and that became the chloroplast, which is that organelle that's responsible for photosynthesis in plants. So that's your trivia for today. You know, you can geek out on your friends and tell them that plants in actually a symbiotic relationship with cyanobacteria. Some of them are responsible for nitrogen fixation. So although our Earth's atmosphere is made up a large component of nitrogen, much of that nitrogen is actually not available biologically. And cyanobacteria have a unique ability to actually take that inert nitrogen out of the atmosphere, convert it, or fix it to biologically available nitrogen that can be used by other plants. They're an extraordinarily important component of the primary production, and in fact are the base of many of our food webs, and also important for carbon sequestration. So this is a very simple life cycle diagram of cyanobacteria, and what this is meant to show you is that they are so prolific and they're so dominant because they have a lot of really unique characteristics that make them able to sort of outcompete other existing phytoplankton. So we're going to start off in the top left corner at number 1 in that image, and you should be able to see these filaments, or these examples of filamentous cyanobacteria. Because in most areas, cyanobacteria, again, they prefer warm temperatures. They do bloom in the summer months when water and air temperatures are warmer. And they also have these gas vacuoles or vesicles, these specialized air pockets that allow them to regulate their buoyancy. And so what this means is that the filament cells are able to move up into the water column and take advantage of the light in order to photosynthesize, and they can move down in the water column and take advantage of all those nutrients that are usually hanging out in the bottom sediments. When summer starts to sort of ebb and you have a bloom and you're limiting in nutrients because you have all of these massive cyanobacteria cells in a water column, some of these cyanobacteria, not all of them, but some of them are able to, again, fix nitrogen. And it's through these specialized cells called heterocysts. So what that means is that even when nitrogen may be limiting in a system, some of these cyanobacterial species are actually still able to persist by taking it out of the atmosphere and then converting it. In the autumn months, when light that tends to decline, daytime is getting shorter, you maybe don't have as many nutrients anymore because of the persistence of the blooms. Some of these cyanobacteria actually have another set of specialized cells called aconites. And what these are dormant vegetative cells. So once the bloom dies off and the cyanobacteria move to the bottom, these aconite cells are essentially dormant cysts that are able to stay dormant in the sediments for months and even years and wait out until other opportunistic temperature nutrient situation arises, which would then allow that cell to essentially wake up again. Because of it has that air vacuole, it would then float back up to the surface and rebloom. So just because an algal bloom has ceased or seems to have died off, it doesn't mean that the cyanobacteria are no longer existing in the system. And that's one of the reasons why they're so pervasive. Some other reasons why they sort of outcompete other systems is, again, these special pigments, which allow them to take advantage of different colors in the spectrum. So they're not just using blue and green, but some of them are able to take up the red and yellow. And they're unpalatable, so they just don't taste good. We often hear people asking, well, there's so many of them, why aren't they just eaten up by zooplankton in the water column? And isn't that a way to sort of manage these colonies of cells? And unfortunately, they just don't taste good. Many of them, like the microcystis blooms that we've all become so familiar with, unfortunately, are colonial. So they simply become too large to be eaten by zooplankton. And they also have a mucilage, this sort of mucilaginous sheath or covering around the cells that, again, make it unpalatable for zooplankton. And even if they do eat them, they might not be digested. And so once they come out the other end, they're still in a whole situation, and now they have nutrients with them. So it actually, being eaten with that mucilaginous sheath could actually sort of help them by creating this new source of nutrients. And again, as I mentioned, Cyanobacteria blooms do prefer high temperatures and nutrients, which tends to be that cause of blooms, which leads us to cyanobacterial blooms in Florida. So I'm going to step back and give you some definitions, focusing on an algal bloom, which is by definition the rapid and substantial increase in algae biomass in an aquatic system. And from this point on, I'm going to kind of use the terms algae and cyanobacteria synonymously, even though we know now that cyanobacteria aren't real algae. And harmful algal blooms, which is an algal bloom that produces toxic or harmful effects on human health or aquatic ecosystems. So just because we have an algae bloom doesn't mean it's necessarily harmful, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's toxic. But regardless, all algae and cyanobacteria blooms need three things in order to exist. So they are photosynthetic, they need sunlight, they need nutrients in order to facilitate that growth. And those nutrients can be already existing in the water bodies, especially in those eutrophied water bodies, or they can come from external sources and be driven into the water bodies through runoff or atmospheric deposition. And they also need time. And this is a component that we often don't think about, but that is really critical for determining what water bodies are going to have algae blooms and when. So if you see pictures, you often see these blooms occurring in canal systems or in dead end systems or in marinas maybe where there isn't a lot of water flow. And that's because in fast moving waters, it doesn't allow the cells enough time to actually increase before they're washed out of the system. So algal blooms tend to occur most proficiently in these water bodies that have slow or stagnant waters. And in Florida, we know we're warm and we have a lot of water. So these stats come from the state of Florida, and just to sort of read some off to you, Florida's total water area covers more than 4,300 miles. We've got more than 11,000 miles of rivers, streams, waterways. Our coastline is almost 1,200 miles long, approximately 7,700 lakes, more than 700 springs, and it's been estimated that there are more than 76,000 stormwater ponds. So should the temperature be right? Should the sunlight be right? Should the timing be right? There is a lot of opportunity for blooms in the state of Florida. And the other component of that is nutrients, of which we also unfortunately have a lot of. I've provided just a list in alphabetical order of some of the major sources of nutrients, and depending where you are, again, geographically in this state, some of these sources are going to be more or less important. So when you're talking about managing for harmful algal blooms, again, it's really important to understand not only what species you're talking about, what type of nutrients it uses, but also where those nutrients are coming from so that you can most efficiently manage for them. So if you recall, I said that not all algal blooms are harmful. Well, harmful cyanobacteria blooms are often referred to as cyanohabs. And we do have a number of toxin-producing cyanobacteria in the state of Florida. I've listed just a few of them for you, and they produce a variety of different toxins and have each of those different toxins have different impacts on wildlife and human health. What this image on the left-hand side is showing you is this is a sort of an average of Central Florida lakes from 2008 to 2011. And what this is showing is that high threshold risk for 100,000 cells per milliliter. So that's kind of a strong concentration of algae, a high concentration of algae indicating a harmful algal bloom. And what this is showing is that we can use satellite imagery to show when blooms are occurring and hopefully be able to use some of that data to indicate if it's harmful, even though toxins cannot be detected by satellite or by the naked eye. So just because you have a bloom, there's no way to tell just by looking at it whether or not it's toxic. But this is really important to note, and it sort of identifies which water bodies we really need to be focusing on. It helps us predict which water bodies are going to have blooms and which ones really need mitigation. So you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, that's Lake Okeechobee. And while in most recent years it's had a lot of blooms, you can see that over sort of a long-term average, the persistence of blooms or harmful algal blooms really only occurs along that western boundary. However, there are some blooms that annually have harmful algal blooms. You can pretty much count on it. And well, unfortunately, I don't think my chat box is working since I've shut down my second screen. I was wondering if anyone wants to take a guess as to what that bright yellow lake is in the middle of the state. That is Lake Apopka. And so we almost always have blooms, harmful algal blooms at high concentrations in Lake Apopka, Lake Harris being second in the state. So for these lakes, if we know that we're going to have a harmful algal bloom, we can pretty much count on it. There are definitely going to be wildlife impacts in some of those, whether it's because of decreases in dissolved oxygen due to the algae removing oxygen or removing oxygen during the breakdown of the algal cells, or from wildlife actually drinking that source of water, which can be harmful and potentially lethal to wildlife and livestock. But there's been much more interest and concern on the possible human health effects of these cyanohabs, especially as they're becoming more prevalent, not only in the state, but nationally and globally. So there are three major exposure routes for cyanohabs. The first being actually ingestion of water. And fortunately for us, most of our drinking water comes from groundwater sources, and most cyanohabs are found in surface waters. So there's very few instances in the state of Florida where ingestion of drinking water is going to be a source potential exposure route. However, swallowing contaminated water can still be a concern, especially during recreational activities such as swimming, jet skiing, boating, those types of things. And they can have some really serious consequences, as you can see in the symptoms column over there. One of the most common health effects associated with cyanohabs is from dermatoxins. This is skin contact associated with cyanohab, And this is most often in the form of a rash or itching or even conjunctivitis. Finally, you can have inhalation of the aerosols associated with the cyanohabs. This again really only occurs during active recreation, and you can have upper respiratory irritation, shortness of breath. What we don't know, and was one of the most active forms of research going on right now in terms of possible health effects, is the long-term health effects associated with exposure to cyanohabs. So because of this, and because we have so many water bodies and so many different types of blooms, we have a really robust algal bloom response protocol in the state of Florida, and they involve many of our state agencies as well as local partners. So the Florida Department of Environmental Protection is responsible for sampling, analysis, and dissemination of results. So they'll go out and actually collect the water samples, they'll take it back to the lab, and they'll analyze it for the type of cyanobacteria as well as the type of toxin, and then disseminate those. If there is a toxin present, they then communicate that to the Florida Department of Health, who's responsible for issuing the health advisories and investigating illness related to HAB exposure. Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission is responsible for the wildlife component of harmful algal blooms, as well as being the principal agency for marine HABs. This does include some of the marine cyanobacteria, such as Trichodesmium that was mentioned earlier, and also Karenia brevis red tide, which I think we're all pretty familiar with. And they also do sampling and analysis. And then at the local level, the water management districts and the county governments, as well as local governments, are responsible for sampling and reconnaissance. And this reconnaissance is a really important component of the bloom response. Remember, we have so much water in the state of Florida that it's not possible for the state, through the Department of Environmental Protection, to have an active monitoring program in every single one of those water bodies. So the state heavily relies on local agencies, partners, and citizens to report observations of algal blooms. And if there are enough reports, and if it seems legitimate, the state of Florida will go out and sample that for, again, both species as well as toxins. So algal bloom response in Florida is primarily directed at two reasons. So it's public health protection as well as aquatic resource protection. But they do use that data to also try and understand the factors that contribute to blooms, determine if there's ways to mitigate blooms, as well as to predict when they're going to occur. And you can see that communication is also a major component of this response. This past year, it might have been 2019 or early 2020, Florida Department of Environmental Protection, FWC, and DOH all partnered together to have one single platform for communicating harmful algal bloom information. It's protectingfloridatogether.gov. And this was in response to the public being concerned and not being able to navigate all of the information that was provided by the state. So now it's in one platform, and you can see where weekly algal samples have been taken and whether or not they were positive for toxins or not. So remember, I mentioned earlier that you cannot tell toxicity just by looking at a bloom, and just because you have a bloom, that doesn't mean that it will be toxic or not. The formation of toxins is actually very energetically expensive for the cyanobacteria, and so they don't always create a toxin. But unfortunately, we can't tell when a toxin is present or not. So the Florida Department of Health response follows the precautionary principle of if you see algae, stay out of the water. The Environmental Protection Agency does have recommended numeric guidelines for both drinking water and for recreation and swimming, but the state of Florida has decided not to use those numeric numbers and to use this precautionary principle approach instead. Again, because not all blooms are toxic, and it's impossible to tell if a bloom is toxic by looking at them. and we have so much water that there might be a bloom that's never going to get sampled, or the lag time associated with it. It's a safer route to go this way. So they have two public signs that they use. There's a yellow caution sign that's placed in publicly accessible points where blooms are observed, but that samples haven't necessarily been taken or analyzed yet. And so this is a caution. There may be toxins, but it hasn't been confirmed. And then the red health alert sign is for when samples have been taken and there is the presence of toxins at that site. But if you look, most of the messaging is very similar. Do not go in that water. Don't get it in your eyes, nose, or mouth. Keep pets and livestock away, and you should not eat shellfish from the location. So I'm going to switch gears now and focus on a case study. Again, Lake Okeechobee. What's unique to Lake Okeechobee is unique to Lake Okeechobee, and what causes blooms in this water body is going to be very different from blooms in other water bodies. So this is just to show you sort of how complicated these harmful algal blooms can be. So just to orient you for where we are in the state, because I know that we have people from all over the state on this webinar. Lake Okeechobee is in South Florida. It's the largest freshwater body in the state, and it's part of the larger Kissimmee-Okeechobee Everglades watershed. So the watershed and the headwaters start all the way up in Orlando, and everything that happens in that watershed will ultimately impact all the way down south through the Florida Keys. So it's an extremely large watershed. It's all interconnected. Lake Okeechobee is artificially connected to the coastal estuaries through the Caloosahatchee River and the St. Lucie Canal. And managing for water, both in terms of water level as well as algal blooms, needs to take into consideration the entire watershed, as does managing nutrients. So just a little bit of an overview of harmful algal blooms in Lake Okeechobee. Just to orient you to the picture, what you're seeing is the lake, and that sort of grassy area on the western basin is a marshy edge of the lake. It's the littoral zone. So it does have a natural marsh over on that western side, and that's important for where we tend to see those blooms. So our algal blooms are normal, and they typically occur in late spring and autumn, and the underlying cause is high nutrient availability. So due to past land uses and human behavior, we have huge store of legacy phosphorus existing in the sediments in the lake. And we have current human activities continuing around the lake that are contributing additional nutrients into the system. And the triggers of when we see blooms tend to be hot, calm conditions. So again, just to reiterate, cyanobacteria really like warm waters. They need calm conditions because that's when the waters start to settle. They're no longer mixed. You have more light penetration. And we tend to see microcystis blooms during these times because those are one of the species that has the ability to regulate its buoyancy. So there'll be hot, calm conditions. You'll have greater light penetration through the lake, which is normally a dark lake. You'll have nutrients on the bottom, and you have this species of cyanobacteria that's able to take advantage of the light penetration at the surface and move down in the water column to take advantage of all of those legacy and current nutrients. So what you're seeing here, these three pictures, this is just to show you sort of why and where we have algal blooms in the lake. The left-hand picture is a picture of the sediments, and you can see that you tend to have sort of more sand and peat along that western margin, which is also where we have the marshes and also tend to have the algal blooms. The middle portion of the lake, that more pelagic zone, has really dense, thick mud, and that's makes it dark, a lot of sedimentation, and it makes it too turbid for that middle portion of the lake to really experience harmful algal blooms, despite the fact that this is where most of the phosphorus loading is or the legacy phosphorus is currently existing. So Lake Okeechobee blue-green algal blooms are strongly associated with lake stages above 14 feet. They dominate in that western portion of the lake where we see the marsh because there's higher light availability and reduced turbidity. And large mid-lake blooms are less common because of that mud bottom. So blooms in the lake are strongly weather dependent. And I know this is a really complicated figure, but all I want you to know is that this is essentially precipitation patterns over time. The red bars indicate that there is a less than average rainfall or a drought situation going on. The blue bars show more than average rainfall. So what you're seeing in that section that's labeled WY or water year 2017 is prolonged drought. So that was a period of time where we were getting very little rain. And what that did was that concentrated all of those nutrients that came from land-based source in the soils. And there wasn't an opportunity for those nutrients to be naturally percolated through the sediments in the soils due to precipitation. So they just continued to concentrate. In the beginning of water year 2018 in June, we had a big storm that dumped a lot of water over that area, and that essentially saturated all of those soils. So they were wet and they were soggy, and then when Hurricane Irma came in September, they no longer had the capacity to hold any more water. So all of those nutrients that were currently sort of concentrated in the sediments and soils got flushed out of that system. And we saw a very similar example of that happening again in the fall of water year 2018 and kind of repeating itself in the beginning of water year 2019. So what that means is when you have a lot of rain, again, the headwaters of Lake Okeechobee start all the way up in Orlando. So when you have so much rain over a short amount of time, it's going to just all flush in. It's known as inflows, and it's measured as 1,000 cubic feet per second. And what these lines are showing you, the red line is 2018, and the other colors, blue, gray, and green, are just different averages. So you can kind of see what the norm is. And so in 2018, in the 2 weeks following Hurricane Irma, we saw almost double the amount of water that we usually see flowing into Lake Okeechobee. And with all that water was a massive amount of phosphorus that came with it. Again, more than 2 or 3 times the amount of phosphorus that normally goes into the lake at any given time. The TMDL, or sort of that nutrient budget for phosphorus that the lake should be at, is 140 metric tons, and we were seeing upwards of 450 metric tons entering the lake in just a couple months. So we had all of these rains, all of these nutrients entering a high lake, and as the weather started to calm down and warm up in June, it was that trigger for those harmful algal blooms that we normally see. And what you can see is that emergence of blooms occurring in June 2018. And within just 2 short weeks, it exploded, taking over the majority of the lake, even that pelagic central portion of the lake that normally doesn't have blooms, such that the max, it was covering 90% of the lake and was still present months later. The reason why it covered a lot of the central portion of the lake was due to prevailing winds. And remember, we had all of that water flowing in the lake too, and Lake Okeechobee is managed for water levels to prevent flooding of surrounding communities. So in times of excess water, water has to be discharged out of those canals into the coastal estuaries. So we had a significant amount of fresh water moving to the coastal estuaries, both the Caloosahatchee on the west coast and the St. Lucie on the east coast, bringing with it those nutrients. We had a significant amount of water from the local watersheds running into the coastal estuaries, bringing with them their own sources of nutrients, which were thus able to sustain those blooms that sort of began in the canals, that extra source of nutrients coming from the basins helped to keep those blooms persistent, such that we saw impacts in all three water bodies. And these impacts are more than just aesthetic and more than just environmental. There's some pretty significant social, economic, mental, and physical health impacts associated with these. So when we're talking about cyanobacteria blooms and bloom management, we need to recognize, first of all, that as precipitation patterns in the state are becoming more extreme, we're experiencing drier dry seasons and wetter wet seasons. These cyanohabs are likely to become more common and perhaps more severe. I was just notified that this past March was the driest March on record in sort of 80 plus years of keeping track of that data. So we're sort of in that cycle again of super dry times, concentrating all those nutrients, and then whether those nutrients get released is going to be dependent on what the wet season brings. And that in order to control them, we really need to look at those nutrients, that nitrogen and phosphorus, throughout the entire watershed if we're going to have improvement in water quality within lakes and the downstream rivers and estuaries. So again, bloom dynamics are complex. We have a variety of different blooms impacting the state of Florida. Cyanobacteria blooms are just one of them. And you need to understand what's happening not only to the species that's blooming, but to the local hydrology and the local weather patterns and the nutrient sources. And in that algal bloom equation of sunlight, nutrients, and time, really the only thing that we have control over is nutrients. So if we have any chance of managing for algal blooms, we have to look at the nutrient sources and try and control and mitigate those nutrients. And so with that, I will stop sharing my computer so that I can see you all, and I will take some questions. Okay.
Yeah, so everyone is muted. There were a few questions. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, there were a few questions that came in, but they may have been answered, but feel free to chat more questions if you have them still. Just basically the difference in appearance between algal bloom and cyanobacteria bloom. If you ask that and it hasn't been answered or you don't understand, maybe give a wave with your hand or a thumbs up.
Okay, so the first question was the difference in appearance of an algal bloom and a cyanobacterial bloom. Well, cyanobacterial bloom is a type of algal bloom. And so really, if you see any sort of discoloration of a water body, that's an indication that there is some sort of algal bloom occurring. It might not necessarily be cyanobacterial. It could be a diatom bloom. It could be a brown algae. It could be numerous other blooms. But discoloration in the water body is that key factor in determining whether or not there's a bloom in that water body. And if it tends to be that really bright green, distinct coloration, that's more than likely going to be a cyanobacteria bloom. Scrolling down, is it possible they are a cause of the panther's neurological problems? It's possible. I was given a heads up on this question, and so I did a little bit of research into it. FWC is examining the neurological problems that's impacting panthers and bobcats. I think to date there's been about 8 panthers and bobcats that are showing this disorder that they've since named, but they don't know the cause yet. They haven't ruled any causes out. So cyanobacteria is just one of a number of possible causes, but they haven't attributed it to anything yet. But of those 8, they're in various different counties. So it's not like they're all concentrated in one area. That doesn't really help distinguish whether it's a cyanobacteria bloom or not, but just to show that it's a more widespread issue than I think they originally thought. Okay, next question. So even though they are called algal blooms, they are not algae. That is correct. But because they photosynthesize and they still require light and they still require nutrients, it's easy to lump them in algae when you're talking about management, but they are not algae. They are more closely related to bacteria. They do not have a nucleus. They don't have membrane-bound organelles. They are not algae. Is the webinar being recorded? Shelly, I think that's a question for you, but I believe the answer is yes.
Yes, I'm recording it and I will be posting it somewhere. I don't know where yet. Probably we'll share it on the Master Naturalist Facebook page just so people can access it there. So I'll follow up with everyone.
I lost Shelly, so I'm going to move on. Next question. When you say they cannot be detected by satellite, do you include using LiDAR? So just to confirm that blooms, algal blooms can be detected by satellite. Toxins cannot be detected by satellite. So you can use satellites to show when a bloom is present. And that's what that picture with the blue, green, and yellow hotspots in the Florida lakes was showing. But it's impossible to tell visually whether you're using LiDAR, whether you're using your naked eye, whether you're using one of like the MERIS satellites. It's impossible to tell if that bloom is producing toxin. So hopefully I clarified that. Yes, Lake Apopka, you guys were right. That algae is a loose term, includes cyanobacteria since they photosynthesize. Yeah, it's technically, yes. I mean, alga, it's becoming a catch-all, even though technically algae are plants. Okay, the panther question I just responded to. Rainfall brings phosphorus, but I thought rain flushes out nutrients that feed blooms. So during normal rain events, the nutrients would just sort of just naturally flush out of the system. But because I don't know if you recall seeing in that graph where I showed the red and the blue and the monthly rainfall patterns, I think it was July and September. So it was Tropical Storm Beatrice and Hurricane Irma. It was so much rain at one point in time. It was sort of like the rainiest rainy season ever. That just flushed it all and brought it with it. Didn't have the chance to actually precipitate any of those nutrients down. It just became a direct conveyance of nutrients into the lake. So, but during normal rainfall, we want normal rainfall because that does help to flush out some of those nutrients. FGCU is doing some research into a link between cyanobacterial blooms and correlation with Alzheimer's, but I've not read anything about connection to panthers. Yeah, so again, that neurological issue with the panthers, it's up in the air. They are looking at cyanobacteria as one of many potentials. And there are a number of universities and scientists who are looking at the potential link of cyanobacteria blooms and Alzheimer's and Parkinson's like related diseases. That link is with BMAA. There's some evidence to suggest that there's a link, but that evidence is not definitive yet, and some of it is controversial. So it's a massive field for new and emerging research, and there's a number of organizations that are looking into that now because it's especially important as we have more of these blooms. Is there data if it has been increasing in cyanobacteria that produce toxins? I'm not sure I'm understanding that question yet, but if I'm understanding the question, it's are toxins producing cyanobacteria increasing? And to my knowledge, no. We are seeing shifts in dominant species. So, for example, in Lake Okeechobee, a cyanobacteria that was once called Anabena and is now, I believe, Delignaspermum, that used to be the dominant bloom forming species, and now it's Microcystis, but Anabano is also toxic. So it's kind of swapping one for the other of toxic species. I don't think we're seeing more toxicity these days. I think septic systems are the largest cause of excess nutrients. That entirely depends where you are in the state. And again, that's why I was really trying to hone in the importance of understanding your watershed and understanding the various sources of nutrients. In some of the springs watersheds, septic systems have been identified as one of the largest contributors. In South Florida, I think it is a contributor, but I don't think we can say it is the largest source of nutrients. We have a lot of sources of nutrients, unfortunately, in South Florida. But that means more opportunities for controlling it. The high nutrients which created the bloom in Lake O, is it also accepted as being responsible for the strength of red thyme bloom, which happened at the same time period? Okay, so this is a complicated question of which I really don't have a great answer for you. We can say it is not responsible for causing the red tide bloom. We don't yet know if it contributed, if the blue-green Cyanobacteria bloom and the nutrients coming out of the Caloosahatchee estuary were an additional source of nutrients to feed the red tide bloom. It's hypothetically possible that it was a source, but there's research, there's a scientist at UF who's actually looking at that right now, but we don't know. I can't conclusively say that it did contribute to the severity of red tide blooms. Red tide, the organism Corynea brevis, is capable of using so many different sources of nutrients that it's likely it would have been a strong bloom regardless. But this Cyanobacteria bloom may have been a contributing source, but we don't know yet. What are effective ways specifically that we can limit nutrients that increase the bloom? Oh, there are so many opportunities. And again, it really depends on where your major source of nutrients are. So whether you're looking at the urban sector, you can look at, and whether human waste is a cause. We can have sewer infrastructure improvements. We can have septic system infrastructure improvements. We can have stormwater infrastructure improvements. We can reduce our use of fertilizers, both in the agricultural and urban context, and use them more appropriately. We can control our water use. When we have excess water, it flushes off excess fertilizers. There really is a number of sources of nutrients that we can manage. And so again, it's recognizing what those sources of nutrients are in your watershed and working to control them. Is there a percentage of blooms that are toxic versus not toxic? No, there's not. According to a USGS scientist who does samples, and this is, not peer reviewed, not standard, but his estimate is that about 30% of the samples that they process show toxicity. There's been other research, national research, that shows about 70% of cyanobacterial blooms are toxic. So it's going to be very dependent on how many samples you're taking, where you're taking them, what the species are. So no, there's not a great sort of standard number of percentage of blooms. The bloom is more prevalent in stagnant water. How can you explain the humongous red tide in open waters? So that's complicated, and hopefully Shelly will have me back to talk about red tides. But red tides actually occur offshore and are brought inshore due to currents. So it's a completely different bloom capacity. it's initiated very differently. It's a different species. It's a dinoflagellate rather than a cyanobacteria. So the bloom dynamics are completely different, just by the nature of it being a marine bloom versus a freshwater bloom. But in general, freshwater blooms need that time in order to persist. No,
Hey,
we
Lisa.
don't. Yeah.
So I'm happy to have you keep answering questions for a few minutes if you have time, but also before too many people log off, if they have other places to be or other Zoom calls to jump on, can we launch the poll just to get people's feedback? And you can keep answering questions while as people do that. But then if before everyone jumps off the call, if you can respond to the poll, it just gives us a little bit of feedback on how useful this was for you.
Yeah, thank you for reminding me. I got carried away in reading the chat. I'm going to launch the poll. This is just an evaluation. It's anonymous. Ooh, you guys are good. We're almost at 40%. All right, looks like about 70% of you have voted and it's starting to slow down. So I'm going to continue answering questions and you can continue to fill out the poll if you decide to. No, we don't know what causes a bloom to become toxic. There's a researcher at FGCU who is actually examining that now, trying to determine what factors sort of are responsible for triggering that gene expression of toxicity. So that's ongoing research right now, but as of yet, we don't know. What's the latest research on how long the semi-decayed algae and associated toxins linger in the water and as sediments vulnerable to disturbance by storm waves? Ooh, I'm not sure I can really answer that in details. What we do know is that the toxins remain persistent even after cells have died for, and again, it's depending on the toxin, and there are a variety of different toxins, but it could be up to a few days. And that's one of the concerns with using sort of chemical treatment or some of the control measures for harmful algal blooms is that you don't want to kill the cells, because once you kill the cells, it releases the toxins, which otherwise would be trapped in the cell. And so, yeah, and is it vulnerable to disturbance by storm waves? I don't know, honestly. I'm going to say, because it's only a few days, I wouldn't say that disturbance by storm is the biggest concern in terms of lysing it. It would be more in terms of other factors that would kill the cells and release the toxins. There's a comment from, it says, I don't believe it has been accepted. Dr. Mitch has some recent research on the isotopes from various inputs of nitrogen to see if there's evidence of direct impact persistence to red tide bloom. I think that's in reference to whether or not the Cyanobacteria bloom was a contributing nutrient source for the red tide bloom. And as I mentioned, that's research is ongoing by a number of scientists. Can I talk a little bit more about the frozen blooms? Unfortunately, I can't. It's not my area of expertise. I know very little bit about frozen or snow cyanobacteria. One of our scientists at UF, Dr. Dale Laughinghouse, did quite a bit of research in Antarctica on cyanobacteria. So maybe that would be a fun talk for all of you. Real quickly, Shelly, don't close the poll, because if you do, it's going to delete it. So if you can maybe take a picture of the poll responses, that would be helpful before we lose them forever.
Okay. I think it saves the results, but I will definitely write them down just in case.
Okay, thank you. Please name the sources of nutrients in South Florida. So I briefly mentioned them before. Basically, I can say yes, all of the above, all of the nutrients that you saw in that list is a source of nutrients. So whether you're talking about atmospheric deposition, animal waste, this is livestock as well as pets. So believe it or not, your pet Fido can be a significant contributor at that local level. Human waste and failing wastewater management systems. Stormwater is a large source. Changing of land use, so urbanization of natural lands and the sedimentation associated with that is a major source. Agricultural and urban fertilizers are a major source. That's kind of, and then reclaimed water in certain communities. Reclaimed water is water that hasn't been treated to full drinking water levels, but is still used for irrigation and contains some levels of nutrients. So excess irrigation or of reclaimed water can be another additional source of nutrients. What causes the cyanobacteria to be toxic? We don't know. That's what's kind of cool about it, is no one knows why cyanobacteria become toxic, and again, what those triggers are. It's not sort of an avoidance for predation thing, because they had this ability to become toxic so early on in their history. It's just, we don't know. It's something really evolutionarily cool about them. Thank you. I'd love to come back and talk about red tide. We already talked about red tide and cyanobacteria. What's the latest research on how long the semi-decayed? Oh, nope, I already read that one. Sorry. I think I've gotten all of them. Okay, according to FMNP instructors, coastal storms could stir up settled red tide toxins in saltwater. Yes, so for red tide, yes, definitely, because the red tide toxins definitely become aerosolized. And so the storms, the wave interactions with red tide, Krimsky brevis, that is a significant contributor and concern for toxin release. For cyanobacteria in freshwaters, aerosolization isn't as much of a concern as it is for Krimsky brevis, because of the type of toxin it is, and because of the types of water bodies that you are. So you don't tend to have large waves in these smaller or freshwater bodies as you do in the marine Krimsky brevis red tide areas. How does glyphosate impact the bloom? That's not really a question I can answer. There is a lot of research to look at the impact of herbicides on blooms and whether the nutrient source associated with decaying plant matter can contribute to blooms, but glyphosate in particular and specifics to herbicides on blooms, I can't talk to. It's just not my area of expertise. I think I got all of your questions.
Yes, thank you, Lisa, so much. That was fantastic.